All right, everyone, ready to dive deep. Today, we're going way back to the early 1800s. Um, really fascinating period in American history, right after the War of 1812, when young nations trying to figure out, well, everything.
Absolutely. And it's a time that's often described as this era of, burgeoning nationalism. But as we'll see, there were some serious tensions bubbling under the surface.
Right, like a pressure cooker. And to really understand this era, we're going to dig into some amazing primary sources, starting with a speech by the one and only Henry Clay. Talk about a passionate advocate for a strong national government.
He really was. And his speech gives us this incredible window into his thinking, especially his ideas about what he called the American system.
Okay, so the American system. What was Clay's big idea?
Well, it was a three-pronged approach to, in his view, really unleash America's potential. First, he was a huge proponent of protective tariffs.
Tariffs? Okay, so those are basically taxes on imported goods, right?
Exactly, and Clay believed very strongly that these tariffs were essential to protect American industries. You see, he argued that by making foreign goods more expensive, you'd encourage people to buy American-made products.
Makes sense. Support American businesses, boost the economy. But I'm guessing not everyone was thrilled about these tariffs.
You're right about that. In fact, the document we're looking at highlights some of that opposition. It mentions how, for example, New England, which was heavily reliant on trade at the time, well, they weren't too happy about the idea of tariffs.
Yeah, because tariffs would make those imported goods more expensive, cutting into their profits. So it created this interesting dynamic where a policy that might benefit one region could actually hurt another.
Exactly. And that's what makes this period so fascinating, right? These regional differences were a big deal. But getting back to Clay, tariffs were just one part of his American system. He was also really gung-ho about internal improvement.
Internal improvements, like what? Roads and bridges and such.
Yeah, exactly. Think roads, canals, eventually railroads. Clay saw these things as absolutely essential to connecting the country, especially as people started moving westward.
I can see that, especially back then. Good infrastructure could make or break a community, right?
Absolutely. And Clay understood that. He argued that these internal improvements wouldn't just facilitate trade and communication, they'd also help to foster a sense of national unity, like physically connecting this vast and diverse country.
Okay, so a big, ambitious vision. But I'm guessing that even back then, spending a ton of government money on these projects probably wasn't universally popular.
You're definitely right about that. In fact, the document we have actually points out that even some of Clay's allies, like Presidents James Madison and James Monroe, weren't entirely on board with using federal funds for these internal improvements.
Wait, really? I thought they were generally supportive of Clay's ideas.
They were, on many issues, but they were both strict interpreters of the Constitution, and they argued that funding internal improvements fell under the jurisdiction of individual states, not the federal government.
Wow, so even back then you have these debates about the limits of federal power. It's like,
Yeah.
plus sought change, right? But you know what else caught my eye in this document? This whole era of good feelings thing. It sounds, well, kind of idyllic. Was it really all peace and harmony back then?
Well, the name might be a bit of a misnomer. Sure, on the surface, you have the Federalist Party kind of fading away after the War of 1812, and the Democratic Republicans are like, we're all in this together.
One big, happy political family.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But even within the Democratic Republican Party, there were some, shall we say, spirited disagreements about the direction of the country.
Which Clay's whole American system really highlights. But speaking of things that divided the nation, we can't forget about, well, the elephant in the room.
Slavery.
Exactly. And as more and more Americans headed westward, the question of slavery in these new territories, well, it became the defining issue of the era.
Absolutely. And this is where the Missouri Compromise comes in. It's a pivotal moment in American history.
Okay, so walk me through it, because honestly, I feel like my history classes in school kind of like skimmed over this part.
Sure. So in 1819, Missouri, which was part of the Louisiana Purchase, applies for statehood, and they want to be a slave state.
Okay, makes sense. But I'm guessing that didn't go over so well with some folks.
You got it. This request throws Congress into absolute chaos. Remember, the balance of power in the Senate between slave states and free states was super delicate.
So adding Missouri as a slave state would, like, upset that balance.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the immediate political consequences, it was about the future. The Louisiana Purchase was huge. Allowing slavery in Missouri could set a precedent for all those future states and territories.
Okay, so high stakes all around. So what happened? How do they even begin to resolve this?
Well, after months of heated debate, they finally hammered out a deal. the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri would come in as a slave state, EUT, this is big, but Maine, which was part of Massachusetts, would also be admitted as a free state.
Okay, so that keeps things balanced in the Senate, I guess.
Yeah.
But what about the rest of that Louisiana Purchase land?
That's where the, let's say, creative part of the compromise comes in. They drew a line on the map, the 36-degree 30 parallel across the Louisiana Territory.
Wait, seriously? They drew a line and said, slavery is cool below this line, not above it.
Yep, pretty much. And that's part of what makes the Missouri Compromise so fascinating to look back on. On the one hand, it prevented a major crisis in 1820. It was a compromise, which, in politics, that's something.
But kind of a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem, right?
Exactly. And the document we're looking at, it really digs into the long-term implications of the Missouri Compromise. It argues that, in a way, it might have actually made things worse in the long run.
Worse. How so?
Well, by literally dividing the nation along a geographical line, the Missouri Compromise kind of solidified this idea of a country divided by slavery. It's like it created the sense of a North and a South, each with its own identity and interests.
And probably made it even harder to find common ground down the road.
Exactly. It's like they tried to sweep this huge, complex issue under the rug, but you can only do that for so long.
Before it blows up in your face.
Exactly. Which is, kind of what happened with the Civil War a few decades later. But circling back to Henry Clay for a moment.
Oh, yeah. His speech takes on a whole new meaning after reading about the Missouri Compromise.
Right. Here he is, giving this impassioned plea for national unity, for his American system to bind the country together, and all the while, this massive issue of slavery is threatening to tear it apart.
It's kind of heartbreaking when you think about it. Like, you can sense the urgency in his words, this feeling that maybe, just maybe, he can convince people to choose unity over division.
He really believed in the power of a unified nation, and he was deeply worried about anything that threatened that unity.
It's like he can see the writing on the wall, but he's not giving up hope,
Exactly, and it reminds us that progress isn't always a straight line, right? It's messy and complicated, and sometimes even the best intentions can have unintended consequences. Kind of like the Missouri Compromise when you think about it.
Totally. It makes you wonder about the compromises we're making today. Are we really solving problems, or are we just, delaying the inevitable?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something I think about a lot, especially when I'm digging into history like this. There are never any easy answers.
That's for sure. But, that's what makes studying this stuff so fascinating. It's not just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world today.
Absolutely. And I think this period in American history is especially relevant because it was such a time of profound change. I mean, think about it. Rapid westward expansion, new technologies emerging left and right, social and political upheaval. It must have been both exhilarating and terrifying to live through all that.
No kidding. Kind of reminds me of today, in a way. We're also facing some pretty big challenges and uncertainties, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to study history, to learn from the past. It can help us understand how we got to where we are and maybe even give us some clues about how to navigate the future.
Well said. It's like that old saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. And on that note, listener, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the early 1800s. It's a period full of fascinating contradictions, larger-than-life figures like Henry Clay, and these really thorny issues that continue to resonate today.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the past.